welcome back, everybody. We're into session 2. I'm so grateful and so excited about all the speakers that we've got in this session. They come from quite a broad range of backgrounds, and what we've tried to do is just give you a kind of a flavour, really, of the journey that we took through the project. And as you can imagine, as the time went on, we were finding out more and more things, and more organisations were picking up the ACE and interprofessional working theme. So we can't squeeze enough into today, so we're on 15-minute slots for our speakers. As Nick alluded to earlier, they will speak one after the other, but please use the chat, put questions in there, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. And we can direct those questions either to the speakers or the people in the project that you would like to ask those. So without further ado, I'll introduce Ellis Brooks from Peace Education from the Quakers.
Thanks, Zoe, and hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I'm very grateful for the invitation. As Zoe said, I work for the Quakers, and I'm not really here to talk about that, but to sum up Quakers, it's nothing to do with porridge oats, but it is a lot to do with peace. Quakers would call themselves a peace church, and that's why sometimes you might see Quakers being arrested to stop Britain exporting weapons to Saudi Arabia or other places of violent conflict, but it's also why they let me work for them doing peace education, and they do the same for my colleague Isabel Cartwright, who's on the call as well. And we first met the Learning Institute when we made a submission on the new Ofsted framework, because we had some concerns about how that was putting too much pressure on schools to police and control young people's behaviour rather than actually do the kind of relational work at that level. And it's been a really rich relationship working with the Learning Institute since then. So Quakers, we try to make peace and non-violence a part of everyday education around Britain, sometimes around the world through partners. If you want to know more about that, there's a link on the screen, quaker.org.uk/peace education. And we've got an online course coming up in the autumn for those who want to know more about peace education. You might think peace, is that the same thing as ACEs? Are we talking about the same topic? But I think it is quite an applicable lens. I'm actually going to talk about a particular aspect of peace education for most of my slot, something called the Restore framework, which I think really speaks to the kind of themes and that this Erasmus project has been looking at, but also this kind of moment in time that Nick was talking about earlier today. But to talk about what we mean when we say peace or peace education, I think one useful frame is to thinking of it as layered. So when I say peace, you might think about, well, it's just the alternative to war at that international level. And it is that, but it's all the layers in between, down to inner peace or intrapersonal peace, so our relationship just internally with ourselves. And then all the relationships you can think about having. You might say the relationships within a school, or you might say the relationships in a broader community. Peace education does have a lot of competences that you might see to teach people, like the knowledge, skills, and attitude. So you might talk about the skill of conflict resolution, or you might say for inner peace, you need that kind of knowledge and understanding of how your body and how your brain responds to stress, to conflict. And you also might say that critical thinking is a very important peace competence, because you need to be able to critically assess when you're hearing a dehumanizing narrative about someone else, whether that's racism or transphobia or something of that nature. And how do you change things for the better non-violently? So peace education is working at all of those levels, and those competencies are more likely to grow where the environment supports them. So you can't just teach the individual those competencies and say, go off and do it, unless the environment, whether it's the school or community, is sort of conducive to that, is actually trusting children and young people to take responsibility when they're facing challenges in life. And I think it's a useful question for us to ask, another peace question, when we're seeking to work on these questions, what are we doing? Are we peacekeeping, where you are using the power and authority you have to control the situation, but you're not really looking at the root causes. And as an example of that, you might talk about, you might picture the blue helmets going into a war zone from the United Nations. And at that point, you've kind of failed already. There's already a huge problem, and you're just trying to mitigate it. But that doesn't mean it's an amoral thing to do. It's you're trying to mitigate something that's escalated, but maybe there are things you should do first. So are you peacemaking? Are you responding to conflict? Internationally, that might be the diplomacy, the negotiation. But in a school, that might mean mediation, peer mediation, restorative approaches where people are seeking to say, yes, here's the conflict, here are the people involved, here are their needs, here are how we can address them, rather than being punitive. So that's a big part of the picture. But also peace building. Peace building means working with positive relationships and building fairness and a shared culture in the school. So it's more of a positive approach to the challenge that we're talking about. You could call it preventative, but I think it's more positive even than that, because true peace is when you have that sense of justice in our everyday lives. So one expression of these kind of questions is a project called Restore, and it was born in the first lockdown, and it was an answer to that question: how can we plan for the return to the classrooms, to playgrounds and corridors of schools? And obviously, at the time, we didn't know how many lockdowns and how complicated that question was going to get, but it was already something that people were thinking about. I was not involved in that question. It was these 7 organisations. You've got a mixture there of schools and experts and external providers who work with schools. I think what unites them is using restorative practice. So they were all doing really good and important work before the pandemic, but as Nick said at the beginning of the day, things have changed enormously now. So in the first lockdown, they knew there was, a ticking clock, and when young people came back, there'd be lots of questions to address. And indeed, we did. We saw surges in the number of referrals for child protection and safeguarding when young people were back in contact with schools and teachers. So there were those really acute issues, and there were shared issues that everyone had gone through. And I think, as Wendy said earlier, we've heard the same thing. Lots of colleagues, lots of schools saying, as young people come back in, they have kind of lost a cohesion, the kind of ability to respond to conflict and cooperate with each other seems to have slipped away a bit. So the environment can be a bit more stressful to come back into than it was beforehand. So I'll tell you a little bit more about this framework, but just to say very clearly, I'm not the author of it. It's an amazing piece of work, and credit to these 7 organisations who, in a very stressful time, produced a really powerful tool that has been downloaded over 30,000 times around the world. So just to picture it as clearly as possible, it's because we're talking about conflicts and we're talking about fairness and justice. You might think it's very serious and grim all the time, and it is important to address the kind of acute challenges, but also restorative approaches in school. In a school can be quite beautiful. They can be fun. Lots of dialogue in a circle, playing games, using visual resources, building relationships by practicing them, by actually having those interactions. And of course, that's what we've missed for so much of the pandemic. Here you can see Peacemakers, a great Birmingham-based organisation, and Calm Manor School, both doing that kind of activity. So sometimes the school own the activity themselves, and sometimes it's an external provider helping them out to sort of develop what we hope would be a whole school approach. The 7 organisations were united, as I say, by restorative practice. So there are certain principles that inform that. And they are that everyone has a unique perspective, that the thoughts and feelings are going to influence the behaviours. So realise that our actions ripple out to the people around us, that we have needs, and that includes connections with other people. and that the people best placed to find solutions to problems are the people affected by the problem. And I think that's super relevant to what has already been said today. You want to work with people, not doing it kind of at them or even for them, nice as that might sound. It needs to be a collaboration. And with Restore, that includes the adults. So yes, there's working with young people, but there's also the staff team of a school working on these challenges for themselves. And as we talked about, that those interprofessional relationships, those interprofessional teams that we find ourselves in, inter-organizational teams, and kind of reflecting on that journey and what those groups of people need as well. I think too often we do fall into that trap of saying, oh, we need to do all this stuff for the children, but we don't think about our own journey that has to happen alongside it and with them. So Restore, as was developed by those 7 organisations, is an acronym. It starts with recognition. So we're starting to look back really before looking forward. So you might say this is about mindfulness and being present in the moment, but it's also about reflecting on everything that's sort of come before, and that's both collective journeys and individual journeys. And obviously in the pandemic, that's a very important context, but you can talk about it with lots of other changes that we've faced. An activity that I heard about yesterday was a reflection on the last 16 months, because that's really the period that we've been talking about, and a kinesthetic, a physical activity where you stand and you take a step for each month, and then you stand there, you take a breath, and you think about what happened in that month, you reflect on it, and then you take the next step and reflect on the next period. And you can do this as a group or individually, but with each step you find yourself kind of going back there and reflecting on those times. And I think sometimes we don't take the time to capture that. Empathy, a really important component of all of our work by the sound of it, certainly in peace education. So as well as recognizing your own journey, connecting with other people's experiences. And empathy is itself a competence. I think you can practice it, and you can work out what you're going to do with empathy when you find it. Safety, obviously there's a very obvious component to that with the pandemic physically in terms of the virus, and that's affected the way we interact with each other. But it's also how do we make sure that these activities, that our interactions are safe, whether we're talking about conflict or doing the relationship building. How can we kind of risk assess that and share responsibility for keeping each other safe? Trauma awareness has been a huge part of what's already been said today. And there's a recognition in this part that there's the collective trauma that we've all had living through the pandemic and its different beats. And then there'll be, I guess, the ACEs in many cases, but those acute experiences of trauma that need specialist interventions, and holding both of those together. So the first 4, you'll see that if you spell those out, you get rest. And that's recognition that we all need a rest. We need a break from what has come up to now before we move forward to talk about opportunities, how we rebuild relationships in schools and wider, about focusing on the relationships themselves, making sure that everyone is included, and that we don't just kind of rebuild the loudest voices or the most visible people. And engagement. It's about actually turning this into kind of shared action, something that we all have responsibility for. So that's a very quick summing up of the Restore framework. It is a lot more than just an acronym, though. There are lots of resources available to guide schools and teachers to use them to go through and organise the individual sessions with, as I say, fun activities, but also to kind of like really reflect on kind of next steps that a whole school might want to take together. I was speaking to a head teacher a few weeks ago who said she didn't want to reset. She wanted to spring forward as a school. And I think that kind of positive, hopeful vision is part of what we need in the culture. Here's another colleague of ours who is actually based in the USA, Tony Jenkins, who works for the International Institute of Peace Education. And he says, if we hold negative views of the future, we are unlikely to change our present course. On the other hand, if we hold positive image of preferred futures, we are more likely to take positive actions in the present. So I think that's what the Restore framework is seeking to do. And I think that's what we're all seeking to do when we talk about our responses. I'll stop there, and thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ellis. And that really was a whistle-stop tour, but I'm sure everybody can see, although that approach is sort of embedded in education, it would easily map across to any agency or organisation. Ellis put on there the links to their resources, and I totally recommend going and having a look. You know, I think everybody will find something of interest. I think two things just to pick up from what you were talking about there, Ellis, is you know, the whole COVID thing and the collective trauma, and some recognition that actually now everybody across all the nations, across, you know, worldwide, has been affected. And I think, you know, there's a lot of work to do now, looking at all of the things that have gone well, actually, in all of our settings, and what of that we might keep into the future. So more about that later. I'll waffle on otherwise. May I introduce Aidan Phillips. He's from Wave Trust. I came across Aidan a little while ago at a conference all around prison responses to trauma. So thank you, Aidan.
Thank you there too, and thank you for that wonderful presentation on Restore. I've got the link open on my screen, and I'll be having a look at that as soon as the conference today ends. So my name is Aidan Phillips, and I work for the charity Wave Trust. Now, our primary focus over our 25-year history has been on how to prevent trauma during the early years when it has its greatest impact. However, in recent years, we've also started looking at trauma-informed practice in services that cover other periods of life. Partly because we think that if you have a trauma-informed society, then that's going to be a route to eventually get to a trauma-preventing society, but also just because it achieves amazing results in and of itself. And today I want to talk about a couple of case studies that show how this type of approach can really have a serious impact in quite difficult circumstances. And through the course of these examples, I'll not only be telling you how they achieve this in both, but just how surprisingly similar the approach was, despite the fact that they are some very different circumstances. And that's why the title of my presentation today is Trauma-Informed Practice, a Universal Approach, to talk about how putting the basics of psychology at the forefront of how you work can be applied to pretty much any job and sector. Now, the two sectors we're going to be focusing on today are housing and healthcare, specifically dealing with very complex cases in both. Now, despite the differences in these sectors, there are going to be some similarities. We're going to talk about work that involved closely interacting with some very vulnerable individuals who had some long and quite complex histories of trauma. These histories had quite a significant impact on their behaviour, and crucially, traditional approaches, for use of a better word, had limited to no success beforehand with them, hence prompting the new change. The first one I'm going to go to is Northwoods Housing in Manchester. Now, Northwoods were part of a wider ACES project, and they were effectively one of the pilot sites who wanted to embed this practice into the way they do their work. Now, at Northwoods, they had an unusually high number of hoarders within their population. Naturally, it's a very small percentage one way or another, but in each instance, you tend to find that there are lots of dangers involved. There's a higher risk of fire. And also for the tenant themselves, because this is a high risk of eviction. And so for everyone involved, it's not a desirable situation. And they did want to try and get to a position where, rather than just kicking these people out or sending them notices, which is obviously very damaging in terms of the impact on their life and very costly for the housing association itself, they wanted to hire a couple of people and then to have them focus solely on some of the most complex hoarding cases to try and actually work with a person to remove the clutter in their house without having to take punitive action. The whole idea is, let's save money on our end and improve their lives at the same time. Let's see how they got on with one case. Now, this just gives you an idea of just what we mean by severe hoarding. I'm going to call this man Joe, because I'm going to use an anonymous name. This is Joe's kitchen when it all started. The rest of the house didn't really look much different. So we're not really talking about a couple of newspapers hanging about that you don't want to throw away. This is piles of rubbish which you cannot bear to let go of, and really feel quite a strong emotional reaction when doing so. Now, the key thing to bear in mind with hoarding here is that, as in many other cases, in this one, it wasn't the problem, it was one among many. Joe, when the caseworkers first went to speak to him, he just shut himself in his home. He literally said the words, "I don't like human beings, I don't want you in my house." Very defensive, very off-put, I should say, by the idea of talking to others. He had a series of habits and fears that are quite unusual. He put milk into a baby's bottle for comfort, and the diet he was eating consisted of just those few things on the screen, which, as you can imagine, didn't really do much for his teeth or for his wider health. As a result, he did actually have tooth pains and abscesses in his mouth. There was evidence of really quite long-term depression and anxiety on quite a severe level. And then, on top of that, there are the masses of rubbish we saw in the house. Now, before the new caseworker, in this case called Jenny, her real name, got involved with this tenant, the officers were on the verge of saying, "We're going to evict him. We don't know what else to do, then we'll have to take legal action." Jenny, in this case, said, "No, we're going to take a different approach." Now, over time, as they got to know this person, they started to learn more and more about the historical adversities that had contributed towards a strong emotional attachment to anything he had, this natural distrust of others, in particular men who he's in close proximity with, and just his general unusual behaviours he was exhibiting. For starters, he had an abusive father who left quite early, and then a mother who herself had mental health problems and was an alcoholic. She didn't really look after his physical needs in terms of washing uniform, dressing him correctly, and so he really didn't develop these habits, and so far got bullied at school. When he truanted from school, the local authorities sent a truant officer, and I'm sad to say this actually resulted in persistent sexual abuse from the officer himself. 20 years before Jenny started speaking to him, and quite a few years after this, he had a wife and child, and he was living a happy life, and they died in a car crash, at which point the hoarding began. So as you can see, we have this complex mixture of childhood and adult adversities and traumas, all compounding each other. So what did it mean to use a trauma-informed approach, and what was really quite a complex situation? Firstly, relationship building. They focused on actually developing a sense of trust of a person who does not instinctively trust people. Jenny would go around regularly. She wouldn't go in the house. He was uncomfortable with that. Just speak to him on his doorstep. Ask him how he was. Ask him what he wanted. Ask him about his needs. Gradually giving the impression she was there to help him. Through this, they focused first on what he actually needed in his life, not on the hoarding itself. So he needed his electricity meter being topped up. They got that done. He was struggling to manage payments for rent arrears. They went beyond what would be the normal call of a tenancy officer, and they just helped him organise that. She even got him in touch with a specialist dentist. This person did not like someone going near his mouth, and especially male dentists. So they got a female dentist who specialised with anxious patients. And through this, they managed to build up this actual bond with a person, and also giving him various improvements in his areas of life provided him with a sense of control. So, for instance, he was scared to be around people and so wouldn't go shopping properly. The reason he only ate chocolate cereals and milk was because they were the closest thing in the local shop when he walked in. So they took him to the shops at night time when it was empty, and just gradually did that with him a few times until he became more confident. As he became more confident, he started doing that more often, and that gave him a sense of control over one area of his life and a sense of pride in himself. And as he builds up this self-esteem and sense of control, then he doesn't feel the need to attach himself to the rubbish so much, at which point they can gradually take it away bit by bit. And all the time they're catering this to a bespoke approach. So this guy doesn't like men being near him. So rather than have the men go in and take away the rubbish, as they often did, that was the service they used, the women in the service would go help him. they'd take it out 20 meters away from the house, and the men would come collect it later when he was inside. Now, you saw that room first off. That's what it looked like. This was the impossible man who was guaranteed to be evicted because there was no possible way of getting through to him. Actually, when they put his emotional needs first and took this bespoke approach and focused on relationships, they did. And they actually saved tens of thousands of pounds in the various costs related to eviction too. So that's case study number 1. Let's have a look at case study number 2. This one takes place at the Springbank ward at Fulham Hospital in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough NHS Trust. Now, Springbank is a specialist ward that works in particular with women who have severe borderline personality disorder. And bearing in mind that BPD is in itself quite a severe condition, you can imagine these are very complex, vulnerable cases where trauma is very prevalent in their lives. So what did they do beforehand? Beforehand, it was very much a protective approach, where you are there to control this person's life because you're working on the basis they can't control it themselves. The doors are locked at night, metal, glass, ceramics are banned. You cannot do things like smoke outside of certain times. And in quite a shocking decision here, self-harm led to a loss of privileges, which I'm quite surprised. It does show quite a lack of understanding as to what are the roots of self-harm. But anyway, the approach was very much about, you can't look after yourself, so we need to control you. Now, the new consultant who came in, and they were really turning over quickly beforehand, said that this isn't going to work. And this evidence really shows it. You can see how compared to the other wards, the number of incidents they were getting were going up. And he said there's a real problem in healthcare in that often specialists are terrified of what happens if they don't try and control things in the patient's life, including legal ramifications for them, but also just compassionately, they're worried about what they will do. And so they put them in a position where they have no autonomy. And if you have no autonomy, then you aren't in a position to really improve because you're reinforcing all those negative views about yourself. You're left feeling like you don't have control of your life. And that can also exacerbate some of the underlying issues, as traumas often relate from situations where you felt vulnerable and out of control. And so we said, we're going to take a different approach. An approach that won't necessarily work with every patient. And they were very specific at the start. They said, we're doing this. If this isn't for you, don't join us. And some did walk away. But this approach was adopted or invited by the majority of people who came to them. And they said, we're going to try positive risk taking. We're not going to have the rules that we had before. We're going to have values. Okay. Our values are safety, recovery, and respect. Everything we do is going to be based on that. And we ask you to sign up to that. But otherwise, it's your call. You want to leave at 2 a.m. in the morning, you can go. You want to use metal, you can use it. You want to go for a walk with your friend, you can do that. But instead of simply leaving everything open to them, what they tried to do was give them more and more control over the program. The activities they were doing, they would be involved in choosing what would take part. They would always be asked their opinion. It would always be a back and forth, and they did it as a team as well. So that you're not just bonding with a practitioner, but the other people around you. They also just tried to change the way in which they spoke to them, the way in which they act to them. Everything's based on respect. Everything's based on trying to get them to believe in themselves. Everything is effectively therapeutic in the way they're approaching it. And what happened as a result? The number of incidents came down to the same level as other wards, which, given that these were the most severe cases, was an astounding achievement. And it's the next slide that really is the reason why I love this case study so much. Prior to doing this, they were frequently having to restrain people and tranquilize them. In terms of restraints, it was 1 a week, tranquilizations about 2 in every 3 weeks. And this is an extreme reaction, given that this is a 12-bed ward where all the beds weren't always filled. So every person there would have experienced this. And if you can imagine about the certain experiences that can contribute towards the traumas and adversities that end up developing into this condition, this is going to be re-traumatizing quite often. As a result of this approach, they managed to bring this down to a nearly non-existent level. Yes, it had to happen very occasionally, but only in extreme circumstances. On the whole, they were able to prevent it through taking this positive risk-taking therapeutic approach. Now, I'm going to bring back this slide from Northwood's housing and the various things that they achieved there. And you can see there is significant overlap across these different sectors, in particular the three I've highlighted there. Whereas the caseworker Jenny focused on building that relationship and trust with Joe over time before even dealing with the issue, in Springbank the focus was on practitioners building relationship with patients rather than being those people who controlled and occasionally restrained them. The sense of control was very key in Joe's case, actually helping him improve areas of his life and building up his confidence so that he felt control on the whole in terms of his psychology, at which point he didn't need to control the waste. In the same way that in Springbank, they'd gone from a position where you're effectively coerced into what you're doing at all times into having a sense of autonomy and feeling like you can actually control things in your life, which put them in a better position to actually give them a sense of greater control over their mental well-being. And the final one as well, this sense of hope and pride. This is we had a meeting in Parliament not too long ago about the Mental Health Act white paper that's going through. And we had someone who had lived experience of borderline personality disorder and had been in and out of health services over time. And she says the best experience she ever had with a health professional was where he told her that it's possible to get better and that she herself can personally do it. And she said, as much as she received tons of technical advice, medical advice, all of which is important, she said, this is what stuck with her, the fact someone else gave her a sense of hope that something can get better. And she said, when we asked her, what do you think the act should include? She says, make it common for health practitioners to routinely try and give their patients a sense of hope in the future, because that positive feeling can really help inspire you to go on. And in the case with Joe and in the case of these patients at Springbank, they were able to build that into everything they did, and really they got better results. I showed you the ones on the screen there, but probably the most touching result in Springbank is that whereas they did have the occasional suicide attempts prior to this, they didn't after they started using the approach. No one's actually died on the ward ever since they brought it in, which is ultimately the most important thing. So on that slightly somber, though still uplifting note, I would like to ask if you have any questions, and overall I hope you found that interesting. If you have any questions, I don't know if we've got time now, but also we'll be on the Q&A later, so you'll be able to ask me then as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aidan. And may I just reiterate, though, if you've got questions for Aidan, please put them in the chat. I think, Aidan, you've very eloquently set out one of the key messages that came from our project is that actually we just need to shift our perspective. You know, there's nothing wrong with keeping people safe or safeguarding them, but actually if you move that perspective just a little bit, you know, it can have really powerful results. Our next speaker is Nigel Hoar from Devon and Cornwall Police. We did have a little discussion about Bear Island that's just behind his right shoulder earlier, so any of you that know it, it's a beautiful part of the country. Over to you, Nigel.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try and attempt to share my screen and hopefully it will work. Okay, so yeah, I'm Detective Sergeant Nigel Hoar. I work for Devon and Cornwall Police. I've been in police since 1999, and I've worked on what always seems to be a relatively new idea of integrated offender management, managing offenders who are our most prolific. They're quite drug dependent and very traumatized from an early age, so it sort of sustains into reoffending. So they're bouncing out of prison, costing a lot of money. When I say relatively new idea, it's a new idea still to police that we can sort of reset and rehabilitate people as opposed to just locking them up. Although I've been doing this now for 10 years, so it's not such a new idea now. So what is integrated offender management? Well, basically it is successful. It's a multi-agency approach where we enable individuals to reduce their reoffending. They engage with us and with partners and volunteers like the Wave Trust, like those sort of organisations. And the joint approach really focuses on the offenders and the most concern, who have sort of the greatest impact on the well-being of our local communities. And the aim is to replace their chaos with stability. And this is through the provision of support and opportunities for successful and meaningful reintegration into our communities, which is quite important to them because they feel isolated and pushed out of communities. So IOM, as we call it, it's a national thing really put in by the Ministry of Justice and the government some years ago. It took over from an old prolific offender scheme, which was a little bit ad hoc and a little bit arrest, catch them, put them in behind bars, do it again when they come out, do it again when they come out, and it just kept going round and round and round. So there was a paper that was produced by a university some years ago called Break the Cycle. And it's a fascinating read, and there's a lot of books about it as well. And there's lots of different publications and things like that you can see. But it was to just try and get people to work together to work on how can we help these people? How can we stop this happening? So we work with probation. We work with drug addiction workers, which is We Are With You for Cornwall. We also work for First Light, which is domestic abuse support. Cornwall Council, the DWP, Safe for Cornwall Partnership. So they're sort of the council that sees over all the commissioning services, and other providers. So we work with private people like Connect, Catch 22, and people like that, looking at people that come out of prison. So we try and manage them through rehabilitative interventions, get them to comply, get them support. But we do have to enforce reducing reoffending based on the commission of crime on occasion. So the aims are really to protect and safeguard victims from the criminal behaviour from these offenders, rehabilitate these offenders and reduce their reoffending within this cohort, and to take the trauma-informed approach to early intervention, as Aidan mentioned just now in his presentation. So it moves on nicely from that, and that is to work with the prevention within the IOM cohort, not the reaction to people committing crime. So how does it work? Well, through Devon and Cornwall, we have offices in Barnstaple, Exeter, Torquay, Truro, and Plymouth. True, we only have one office, but I do manage sort of a double team. So because the shape of Cornwall is it's a bit of an odd one to work with, really. A lot of people work very close to their cohort as are spread out over quite some distance. It's a multi-agency partnership working in co-location, which is crucial to this. It's always a best practice. It's never enforced, which is, I'd like to see it enforced really, but and become part of the criteria. But it is one of those things that is a best practice approach where we're all sitting in the same office, we're all exchanging information, because these people, as often as not, they do tell us fibs, and they'll tell probation one thing, they'll tell us one thing, they'll tell their drug worker one thing, whereas if we're working together, they can't do this. So it breaks down those barriers and gives us some sort of consistency to work with these people and get these behaviour change. We're also committed to doing things a little bit differently. We're now working with behaviour change IDVAs, which is working with the perpetrators of domestic abuse, not just the victims. So it's trying to break their cycle, trying to get their behaviour patterns on track, and trying to reduce those and reduce the number of victims for DA, which is really important at the moment. And then it's developing IOM to meet and involving these in demand. So utilising things like GPS tagging, as I mentioned there, which I'll come on to in a second. So that's where we are. Those are the bits there. So I cover the orangey pointy bit down the end, which, as you can see, is quite vast, and it does cover the whole length really, and it takes sort of an hour and a half on a good day to go from one end to the other. So it is sort of quite drawn out. So keys to success really is the leadership and commitment from all partners, It's a continuity in offender management throughout the system, open information sharing, as I mentioned just now, discussion, making risk assessments, looking at what the best needs are. I'll come on to some of those needs in a second. Fast track access to key support services like drug treatment, accommodation are very important. And the estates planning for the co-location, so very important. We share offices in Cornwall in probation buildings, so I don't work in a police station. I don't wear a uniform to work, as you can see. So we can meet people and it breaks down those barriers, so they don't see us as police officers. They will often tell us things and say, don't tell the police. We are the police, you've just told us, so we have to keep reminding them that. But they say, well, you know what I mean. They see us as quite different and quite approachable. So much so, this is a voluntary thing that we do. We can't make them come onto the scheme, but we can certainly coerce them into working with us, and there are other ways that we can do this. Part of that is the GPS tagging, which I mentioned, which is voluntary. It's not a thing put on by the court. That's a different side of things that can be put at sentencing and things like that. But we've used this to give people the chance to stay in the community and work on what they've already built with a GPS tag, and the courts will look at this, and we actually put these on people, and we can monitor where they are. So if, for instance, they've got someone in a town that is renowned for burglaries, and it's that age-old thing, they start to get some burglaries in say St Austell, then they always seem to point the finger, and it's got to be them. We can prove from this GPS tagging, and it has worked, and we have proved this, that these people are nowhere near these burglaries. They are complying, so it gives them a sense of pride and a sense of ownership of this system, that basically they can prove that they were nothing to do with it, and it's that the eyes on them are put elsewhere. So it's evolving technology. It's quite cumbersome. That picture there, it is quite a large block. It's like the old Nokia mobile phones, basically, that stuck on their ankle. But they've now worked on one which is sort of the size of a watch, and it can be worn on the wrist or the ankle. These are worn on the ankles. So we have 5 or 6 of these in Cornwall, and we deploy them out, and it's really good. It's quite useful. Now, I mentioned what we were looking at with the needs, and this comes on to the pathways. We work on 8 pathways, and these pathways are used throughout the country. Some will have slight changes. We've got one on there which is a slight change for some. A lot of people work on 7 pathways. So one of the most important ones we look at is accommodation. We look at finance management income, intimate relationships, and that's the one that we have as a separate. Attitudes, thinking, behaviour, education, training and employment, and this could be from young and old. Mental and physical health, drugs and alcohol, and family, lifestyle and associates. That's the one that sometimes intimate relationships is intermingled to make 7, but we like to split out to work on 8. It gives a better score for us. So we'll look at this, and we'll have people referred to us, and we'll score them on this and a matrix from probation, and it works out a predictability of what their offending's like, and are they likely to re-offend. If all of that is missing, if they haven't got this, so they're into drugs, they haven't got any sort of help with that, they have some mental health issues, they have some physical health issues, education, employment is down, attitudes, thinking, behaviour. If all this is missing, all these chinks in this that we can't mend, they will re-offend. If we can start to build this and give them accommodation, give them stability, get them in touch with Department of Work and Pensions, get their universal credit benefits coming in, it now starts to build a picture, get their attitudes, thinking and behaviour by going on to programs with local partners. This builds the picture to get them stability and to stop that re-offending. So the effects on prolific offenders, which comes back to those pathways, and a lot of it is brought on by adverse child experiences, as we're talking about today, childhood sexual experiences, traumatic brain injury, sort of a learned behaviour, and of course peer pressure, and having influence effects from all those 8 pathways. A lot of those pathways are affected by adverse childhood experiences. So it could be accommodation, it's attitudes, behaviour, it's learned behaviour, it's education. A lot of those people that have these adverse childhood experiences won't have access to good education. They won't have access to good, stable families, good accommodation. So we can already start to see at a very early age is a massive influence on how these people are affected, and how it affects the behaviour for prolific offenders. So adverse childhood experiences, as I'm sure you looked at today, stressful traumatic events that basically have an impact on their childhood development. And this could be for anything from family or, actually things themselves. It could be health problems. It could be domestic abuse problems within the house that they experience and see. It could be substance misuse, not necessarily themselves, but something that they are prone to and subjected to and can see. It could also have direct adverse experiences, which is the maltreatment, the abuse, the neglect, the indirect experiences of those experienced within the household, as I've mentioned. So it has quite a big effect. So looking at an early age with Restore, as Ellis spoke about, is critical, I think, this day and age to try and combat some of these people that go on to be lifelong criminals and lifelong prolific offenders. So the most adverse to child experiences, the more likely are to impact on their lifelong mental and physical health. Evidence suggests, obviously, that children exposed to 4 or more experience are likely to become risk-taking behaviours, and they're going to start testing the water with their offending, and it builds and builds and builds. And once they get into that slope of being caught and put in prison and come back out, that never-ending cycle just keeps going and keeps going. And this is where we come in and try and stop it. So going on from that, there's a few little bits here I just wanted to show you about prisons, this slide and the next one. A couple of things we've worked on are traumatic brain injuries, so TBIs. And the results from this very, very similar to those with people that have suffered some of the ACEs. And we find our prolific offenders actually suffer more than just the 4. They pretty much tick all the boxes. There's about 10, I think, and they tick the whole lot. So looking at this, we found that the average age of first imprisonment is 16 years for a traumatic brain injury and 21 years for a non-traumatic brain injury. It also can be said the same of those that have had a traumatic effect from early childhood with ACEs. And this was just sort of something that we used to look at with people in and out of prison. So most of them saying, yes, they had some sort of brain injury. And it could be some of those were from childhood experiences where they've been abused and they've been beaten. And it's not necessarily been knocked unconscious or anything like that. It's just something that's triggered and it causes the brain to grow in a different way, shall we say? And it's fascinating stuff. So offenders cope poorly with life because they exhibit various cognitive deficits, which comes from the 1985. So lack of impulse control, poor at controlling emotions, poor problem solving, rigid, inflexible thinking. They don't recognize the consequences of their behaviors and can't see another person's perspective. These actually fit in with ACEs, because if they've had these adverse childhood experiences, they have this lack of impulse control. They can't see another person's perspective. They don't see anything wrong with taking something that doesn't belong to them. It's that rigid, inflexible thinking. It's that controlling emotion. They just can't seem to cope with it and do this. A quarter of inmates at the moment in prison are between 15 and 24 years of age. And the adverse childhood experiences are those that are most prevalent in those people. So it becomes a theory of the mind. Prolific offenders tend to be early starters because of these ACEs, because of the childhood sexual experiences, and because of brain injury, all those sort of things that they've had. And then they would go on to commit 77% of crime. And there's that age-old quotes of people, 77% or 80% of the crime is committed by 10% of the people. It's always that. It's a very low percentage of people committing crime, but it's a very high crime rate. And this is where we start to sort of have a look at. So 1 year post-release, 45% were reoffending. After 2 years, there was 75% reoffending, which is very high. So that's where we come in. That's where we do it. So the keys to success are understanding influences and behaviours. So going back to the history, the illnesses, the injuries that they've had, looking at those pathways, looking at experience as a child, exploitation, exposure to criminal behaviour, something that they see as normal because they can't comprehend it. And they haven't got the capacity to do that because they think it's the normal way of behaving. So that lack of emotion. We introduce and eradicate the pathways, as I've said, to a better way of living and self-esteem. Give them the confidence to go out there and get jobs. Give them the confidence to go out, get the skills, the courses to get to that better way of life. Open opportunities for education and employment. Some of them go back into colleges, some go back into even universities. Eliminate undesirable influences, peers, drug dealers, all those people that sit around them. So we're careful at where we house people. There are lots of things in the news that you see and articles in the papers that you see about these blocks of flats that are used just for all these offenders. It's all drug dealing. We try to avoid those places where it's controlled and it's warden controlled and managed, some by the council, some by the private sector. Early intervention. So looking at what Ellis is doing, looking at what Aidan's doing, it's those sort of things and tapping into those availability of people that can work with these people to try and slow it down and stop it before it even gets going. And justice, what fits the crime, and diversionary tactics. So it's not necessarily lock them up. It is looking at the tag. It is looking at other opportunities. It's giving them conditions that they can stay out in the community if they do these programs and work with us and work with people like that. So that is a really quick whistle-stop tour of IOM. I could probably talk for about 2 days because all those things are so complex. But yeah, it's quite a heavy subject, and I apologize if I've just spoken at you. But Zoe, that's me for that. We'll take some questions later.
Nigel, thank you so much. And I do feel your pain of trying to fit it into 15 minutes, that there's so much complexity there. What I really got from that, we're back to giving people control, aren't we? And giving them choices about how they can, improve in the future. So I think, and great interprofessional working, that's the key to it, isn't it? Thank you for that, Nigel. And I'm sure there'll be loads of questions in the chat around that. Okay, so our next speaker is Wendy Ohlson from the virtual school, who you may have met in the first session this morning. Wendy's going to tell us all about virtual school and what they've been doing.
This is when you wish you'd gone first, really, because there's a lot of fabulous practice going on out there, isn't it? It's amazing. Okay, let's see. Has that shared, Zoe? Can you see that?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. So apologies to some of you who do know a lot about the virtual school already, as I said earlier, but I am conscious that some people don't know much about the virtual school. I've been a teacher for 30 years and I still didn't know very much about them, even though I was the designated teacher and I knew they were out there, but I didn't really know all the things that were on offer. So I thought I'd give you a whistle-stop tour through. What I'd like you to do whilst you're listening or looking out the window or whatever it is you're doing at the moment is just if you could think of a teacher who you really, really remember that stood out for you at school. You don't need to tell us who it is. You don't need to tell us why you remember them, but I'd just like you to get that teacher in your head. And then a little bit later, if you wanted to share who that was in the chat and why, or you don't have to put their name, but why, that would be handy. But it doesn't matter. The exercise will work just doing this in your head. So virtual school, what are we all about? We are an organisation, a local authority organisation, with the aim of promoting positive educational outcomes for all children in care in that local authority. We're the same as any other school in that we have a school role, we have governors, we have high expectations for our students, we monitor attendance, progress, exclusions, we have a head teacher and staff members, we have a budget, but we're different because we don't have any buildings, we don't actually have timetables and children coming into our buildings and classrooms and all of that stuff. And we're different in that we work with every single school where there is a child in care to Devon, whether that's in Devon or outside of Devon, because many of our children are placed out of the local authority, some for their own safety, some because they need very specialist provision and that isn't found in the local authority or it's full in Devon. So they're all over the country. We also have young people from other local authorities that are placed in Devon. So it's all a bit bonkers, really, that some are going out and some are coming in. But the purpose is for us to make sure that we're supporting and absolutely promoting schools in having the highest expectations and aspirations for those children in care. So we challenge schools, we support schools, we celebrate all the things you would do if you were in a regular school. And I just thought this was a little bit of context that we have 78,000 children, give or take a few thousand probably, because they come in and they come out, as you'll all know. That is a lot of young people, but it is only actually 1% of the children in the UK. And sometimes when you're working in this, it's a bit like any of you who are working in school. If you're the behaviour manager or you're in the pastoral team, sometimes you do lose perspective on all the children that are going to school, having a really happy day. Their home lives are fantastic. They go on lovely holidays. Their families love and care for them. But when you're working with those where that's not happening, you do sometimes need a little step back and a refresh for you as the professionals to keep that in mind. We have a very high number of our young people in care across the country who have special educational needs of some kind, more and more mental health issues for our young people. And it's not rocket science to work out that some of the experiences that they've had before they came into care, which is why our Bridges project is so important in trying to work with those young people who are not getting care. And then when they come into care, they're often having to move placement more often than we would want them to. And that again reignites the trauma and the attachment and the loss that they've already been through. This is just to give you a bit of an idea of numbers, and obviously every local authority is different. Currently we've got 874 children on our virtual school roll, but just over 200 of those are in care to other local authorities. So we're not as involved with them. We keep an overview of how they're getting on. But the 645 children, and the numbers won't add up exactly because we have a few that aren't in school. We've got some that are in nursery. That was just to give you a bit of a feel really of where we are. So we work with children from the ages of 3 to 18, really just making sure that we're supporting schools, carers, social workers to do the best that we can to repair the situations that those young people are in. From September this year, the virtual school is going to extend its remit to be working with all children who have a social worker. That's a national initiative. It did come a little bit out of the blue. It came to us on the 16th of June. We knew it was being discussed, but for the reasons really that actually all those children will have had some adverse childhood experience. If they're needing to have a social worker involved in their family, it's quite likely, if not obvious, that something has not quite gone to plan. So we will be taking a more strategic overview of those children. We won't be working with them in quite the detailed way that we do with children in care. For us in Devon, that means another 2,500 children will come on the virtual school radar. So we've currently got around 1,900 children on a child in need plan and around 600 on child protection. So we're talking about a lot of young people here who are either in the care system or are on the edge of care or having support through social worker. So all our children in care will have had a number of adverse childhood experiences. It's just that is the case. And that will be around neglect in many cases, emotional and physical neglect of their needs. Many of our young people have suffered abuse, either emotional or physical or sexual, and many of them have been witness to numerous cases, incidents of domestic violence. They've often had a very poor school experience. Some haven't, some have been absolutely sailing along in school. Somehow, by some miraculous, they've used school as their place of safety and normality, I guess. I can think of children I worked with over the years who we had no idea of the chaos and carnage that was going on at home, and felt very guilty when that came out that we hadn't been able to help those children. But many have a very poor experience of school. So before they come on our radar, they may have very low attendance. They may already be at risk of exclusion. They may not have had that aspiration and interest in their learning that we would hope that children would get from their family. They may have really not had much involvement from family members in going to parents' evening and supporting them to take part in activities and all those things that our families hopefully did for us. So there are going to be big hurdles for these young people in trying to rebuild their trust in school and their own expectation of what they can do. They are sadly more likely to be excluded from school, to have poor mental health, and their educational outcomes, as we see nationally for children in care, are much lower than for children who have grown up in their family. We were thrilled this year that our GCSE results shot up in Devon. They actually really were much better than other local authorities for children in care across the country, whereas traditionally they have been quite poor. They're still only half, though, the expected progress for children who grow up in their family. So we have a massive outcome gap for children in care. And there's no surprise that we think a lot of that success this year was due to the fact they didn't sit exams. Many of our children they work really hard at school, they try their best, we go to meetings, and if the wind's blown in the right direction and we can get them in the exam room, they have a pretty good chance of getting a 4 or a 5 there across the board. The time comes for exams, though, and actually that is just such a barrier for them. So ACEs have a major impact on their life chances without a shadow of a doubt. One of the big areas that we are investing a lot of time and energy in are those outcomes for young people when they get to the end of their education. And we all know that NEETs are a problem, but NEETs for children, young people who've been in care are an additional problem. So we're putting a lot of energy into identifying children from the start of year 7 now who display characteristics that may lead to being NEET and putting interventions in really early. That's been quite difficult in the lockdown, actually. It's been a barrier to us, because a lot of those interventions need to be face-to-face or taking very early secondary children to colleges, universities to have looks around. All of that's had to stop, obviously. But we do have some projects running, again, through our education psychology service, where we're looking at raising aspiration and interest in learning, because if we can change it round when they're in year 7 and 8, hopefully we can prevent those young people becoming NEET later on. We have had a good lot of success with that. And I think some of that was the improved outcomes last summer meant a lot more young people managed to get on college courses that they may not have got previously, and actually had a greater self-belief that they could do it. And so we need to keep that momentum going. This is kind of an overview of what we do as a virtual school. We do an awful lot of tracking and providing interventions. So we track attendance of every single child in care and talk to schools when we see that attendance is dropping. So that we do that on a daily basis, just like you would with your own school if you were working in a real school. We look at their progress. So we run what are called PEPs, personal education plans. They happen every term for every single child, whether they're in Devon or outside of Devon. And that tracks their progress in every subject and looks at the wider element of going to school. How are they feeling about going to school? So we try to capture the young person's voice, what would make school better for them. So we do it under what's going well and what would make it even better if we could do this. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the carers are involved, that they feel welcomed and able to discuss things with schools, to make sure that young people have a key adult in school that they feel they can talk to if they want to. Many of our young people really, really want to be at school and not known as a child in care. They want to be like everybody else. And many of them are extremely successful at school. We try very hard when placements have to change to keep school stable. Because we all know, I'm sure you can remember, if you move school in the middle of your GCSEs, it's going to be really, really hard to catch up with that learning, because each school will run different GCSE syllabus from different exam boards. So in Key Stage 4, we particularly try to keep those placements as stable as we can. We have to have some quite difficult conversations with schools sometimes. We challenge schools about their target setting for children, about the support they provide for children. We sometimes find that in some occasions, secondary schools will set their GCSE targets just based upon their Key Stage 2 outcomes. If you've come into care midway through year 6 and your life is all over the place, your Key Stage 2 outcomes are likely to be much poorer than your actual working ability. And so we try to say, let's not have systems, let's have individual, known, cared for children. When I was deputy head in a school, I always use the phrase, keep me in mind, because that our children often don't have anybody to keep them in mind. And I think that as corporate parents, that's a really important thing for us. So we need to work with schools to see these children as needing a little bit more, needing something a little bit different. We celebrate successes just like any school would. So we send lots of cards and book tokens, and we have a big event once a year where we have everybody gathering, and we're looking forward to doing that rather than virtual celebration days. Don't work terribly well. We put in a lot of support for schools. We have pupil premium funding, which we give to schools on a termly basis, again to support the child, but we also encourage schools to use it for training that they feel that they need for individual members of staff or for whole staff groups. We do provide a lot of training. We've been able this year to offer a free training programme on such a wide range of topics for school staff, because we really believe that the teachers in the schools are the ones who are going to make the difference. And so projects that we found have been really, really successful in that. We've worked with the EP team to develop attachment-based mentoring training. And our aspiration is that every single school in Devon would have an attachment-based mentor. We're not quite there yet, but we are getting towards that, which would be somebody in the school who would be the designated key person to look out for that child. Although we have designated teachers, they are busy people. They would take the overview, but the mentor would be the person who could draw alongside that child and really make sure that every single thing that they need for success was in place, that they'd have somebody to talk to. So we've been able to continue that virtually during the lockdown, which has been fantastic. We've got an amazingly skilled team, not from the virtual school, but if you're in the workshop with Catherine and Matt this afternoon, you'll hear a little bit more about how they operate. We've also been able to offer schools to be part of the Timpson project, which I'm sure lots of you have heard of. That offers whole school training on attachment and trauma. And then the second part of that is for the school to have support in running a project within their school to try and change practice. And we've worked with the inclusion team in Devon to provide that for our schools. We've also got a relational practice project running, which does a very similar thing. It's trying to help schools in whole school training, but then also honing down to looking at their behaviour policies, looking at how that can take into account what a child who's experienced trauma and attachment might actually need, what might work better. Because actually, if it works better for those children, it's going to work better for everybody. It's not just about the little niche group. So I'm quite excited that our remit's going to extend to a wider group of children. During the lockdown, I think many of us were very conscious that children in care were pretty much sorted, actually. They live in safe places. Yes, they're not with their families, but it was those children that are on child protection and child in need who are still with their family and still in the environment of the abuse or the neglect or whatever it is that's going on. So to be able to widen the remit for us, although it's a bit daunting and a bit out of the blue, hopefully that will help a wider group of children. The last thing we do really is to try and make sure that we are able to help with the social worker team and the carer to ensure that children in care have those wider life experiences that we might have naturally had when we were growing up, so that they can still go to football club, they can learn a musical instrument, they can go on all the school trips, that they have activities in their holidays. So we have a fund that we have for all children, but we also talk with foster carers about what else do you need, what else can we put in place to try and make those children's lives as fulfilled and positive as we possibly can. All of this is about building positive relationships. I'd like you at this point, because I don't need to read the slides to you, to just think about that teacher that you had in mind at the beginning. And if you want to share in the chat why you chose, maybe best not put Mr. So-and-so and put his name, but why did you think of that teacher? What was it about that teacher that really stuck in your mind? When I was in school, I always used to give anyone who was new into the pastoral team a book called The Magic Weaving Business. I don't know if any of you have come across it. It's by someone called John Jones. And it is such a very straight talking book about how relationships are the key to everything in any environment, but particularly in school. And there's a little piece in here which I'll just read you. It says, a teacher once described how he had bumped into dozens of past students. Not one of them had ever said, "Sir, that worksheet changed my life." And he said, and I spent hours on those worksheets. And then a little bit later, he says that the good thing about education is that teachers make a difference. The bad thing about education is that teachers make a difference. And we all know that if I had to think of my teacher that I'd keep in mind, it would be my RE teacher. No fluke that I became an RE and PE teacher, perhaps, but I can't remember a single lesson that I had with her. I remember nothing that, apart from I remember a school trip that she led, but I do remember how she made me feel. She made me feel that I could achieve. No one in my family, there's no history of going to college or university. And she made me believe that actually that was possible and that I should at least have a little think about it. And it made me feel valued and part of a different kind of community. And I suspect that most of you either remember a teacher because they made you feel scared as they threw the board rubber at you. Shows how old I am, that there was a board rubber. And that it, interestingly, our physics teacher, when I was at secondary school, was a dab hand with the board rubber. He could pick out an individual student from the back of the class. And you know, I lived in fear of physics because I had to dodge the board rubber. And
Wendy, you'll be pleased to know that when we train teachers now, we've left that element.
I'm very glad.
Of
That's very good.
Throwing it. You won't be able to see it, Wendy.
I can't see the chat, no. So if you could help me out with that, that would be great.
Yeah, there's really good comments starting to appear there, which would be really good.
Great, thank you. Thanks, folks, for sort of taking the time to do that. And the final slide really from me is, for me, the children in care, they are our children. They're all, as corporate parents, which is what we sign up to when we work in the local authority, it's our job to prepare them for their future. And although that was written in the year 2000, that doesn't change, does it? And we're really trying to work with schools, carers, other professionals, health, CAMS, everyone that possibly we can get on board to try and make their education experience as close as possible to any other child who's grown up without these experiences and without being removed from their family, as if they were growing up in their family. So that's what we do, and you'll hear a little bit about one of the projects that we're running to reduce exclusions if you're in that workshop this afternoon. So I hope that's been useful in just summing up what we do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And you know, you're talking about a particular group of children there, but actually the key themes and the key messages, they're the same for all our children, aren't they? You know, let's be interested, let's make it personal, let's be creative about how we will help them. And most of all, I used to use a term which I'll probably get shot down in flames for using now, but you need to be an unprofessional professional to build the relationships with the children. The workshop this afternoon around the optimistic child, I'm sure we'll pick that up. May I welcome Anne Ferguson. I usually have to start the sentence, lovely Anne Ferguson, because she is. She's from our Learning Institute, but she is an absolute expert on domestic abuse. She'll talk to you about this particular adverse experience for children and how that's changed over the last 18 months.
So obviously we've only got 15 minutes, so it's a whistle-stop tour. Domestic abuse is incredibly complex. If we add in the pandemic that we're currently experiencing, what we do know and what research is telling us is that abusers are using it to continue to isolate their families. So we're going to briefly touch on that, and I'm going to give you some basic statistics and some basic understanding, which you already will have, of course. So domestic abuse is an adverse childhood experience. It impacts children, it impacts their brain development, it causes toxic stress, and it can have lifelong consequences. It can be devastating for children. I am just going to explain some of the language that I will be using today. So I am very aware, as all of us are aware, that domestic abuse does not just happen to women and children. Men can also be abused. However, what we do know is that 95% of abuse that happens, there is a male perpetrator. As well, today the presentation is going to be from a heteronormative stance, but again, we're not missing out, we're very aware that domestic abuse doesn't discriminate, and neither do we. LGBTQ communities, travelling communities, there are domestic abuse can impact anybody. The point is the impact that it has, and particularly on children, which is what we're going to be talking about today. It is a misuse of power. When we're thinking about our project at the moment, we need to be thinking about the intersex of abuse. So domestic abuse is linked to other forms of abuse, and we're going to be kind of talking about that as well a bit later on. The presentation also doesn't aim to vilify professionals. When we're talking about multi-agency working, we're not saying that any one professional misses anything. We don't go out in the morning and think, right, actually, I'm really hoping that actually I forget to do that piece of admin, or I forget to pass that piece of information on. Nobody does that. However, we do need to be mindful, and as Zoe said, we need to be professional, but we also need to be really curious as well. If something doesn't feel right in a family environment, if we're visiting that family, then it probably isn't. So it's, it is really important to be making those safeguarding decisions with people around you. You should never make a safeguarding decision on your own, and you will all know that stuff. But when it comes to domestic abuse, it is becoming, the awareness is out there now. We are recognising that it is linked to other forms of abuse. But I think because it is so prevalent, sometimes we don't recognise what that child is actually living with. So with that in mind, I am just going to give you a little bit of a health warning, because in a moment I'm going to be asking you to listen to a video clip. Not a video clip, a sound clip. And if you take nothing away from today, take this, from this presentation, because this is what a child could be living with. They may not phone the police, they may not make that 999 call, but they may come into your professional context, they may come into school, they may, you may see them as a health visitor, and know that they're living with domestic abuse, but not actually really grasp what they could be living with and how that's impacting them. So I just want to give you that health warning. So if this does make you feel uncomfortable, please feel free to leave the session. And of course, as an organisation, we have a responsibility to keep you safe. So if you are feeling worried or unsafe, then there is some time for questions at the end, and we can perhaps talk to you then. And of course, if you share anything with us as an organisation, we would need to pass that on. But we would, that puts you, a member of the public, or a child at risk, we would need to pass that on. But of course, we discuss that with you first. So I'm just giving you that health warning now, because this clip can sometimes make people feel uncomfortable. Okay, so I'm hoping it will work. So I'm going to play it now, hopefully.
We've got a domestic kicking off there. Oh, line back up. Yeah. It's the police. Your mum and dad? Yes. Right, how old are you? I'm age 5 and 2. I'm fighting as soon as you can. Get this guy on it, please. Help. Please. Stay on the phone to me. What? Stay on the phone to me. Does your mum need an ambulance? Does your mum need an ambulance?
So I've heard that clip hundreds of times probably, and I know Zoe's heard it, and I know Nick's heard it, and I'm sure lots of people have heard it, but every time I hear it, I feel for that child. The call handler was excellent, brilliant, handled that really well, but that child may have gone to school the next day and experience that. So if we take nothing away that from, as I've said, from today, then please take that away, because children who are living with that kind of adversity will be impacted. They're not innocent bystanders. They are involved, and they are listening and hearing somebody that they care about being harmed, and that's not okay. What's really interesting for me about that call as well is sometimes I was listening to Radio 2 a couple of weeks ago, and I heard the presenter Jeremy Vine actually talking about a young child that had phoned 999. He'd rung 999 because there was a fire next door, and the parents had gone in to help to bring people out of the building, and he had phoned 999, and he'd been very brave, and he was applauded, and he came on the radio, and everybody spoke to him and said how wonderful he'd been. How many children do we talk about that have done this, that have phoned 999 to keep their parents safe when they're being abused? And we don't hear about those children. It is a hidden crime. So I think it's just important that we do recognise that there are children doing this and living with this. I don't know if anybody watched Home Truths on BBC iPlayer, Ian Wright, the footballer, and I watched that, and again, that might be something that you might want to watch, because the impact for him has been lifelong. So he's gone into, you know, he's a Premier footballer, or he was a Premier footballer, you know, had a very successful career, but the impact on him has been lifelong. His anger on the pitch, his, you know, relationships, his relationships with his mum, his relationships with his sibling, they've all been impacted. And he's 58, I think now, and he's still distressed by it. So it does have a lifelong impact. So we, you know, we just need to remember that when we're thinking about children. So some statistics here. We know violence against women and girls is a global issue. We know that there are lots of reasons for violence against women and girls, but what we do know is there doesn't seem to be an easy fix for it, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. And when we think about the pandemic, we have managed to mobilise billions of pounds in this country to address this pandemic, but for some reason we haven't been able to mobilise money to keep women and children safe in the domestic abuse sphere. Now, when we're thinking about families, that's where you are supposed to feel safe. And Wendy was talking about, you know, children in care, and if you don't feel safe in your family, where do you feel safe? So as professionals, we need to be recognising that children who are living with domestic abuse aren't safe. They're not feeling safe. They're not feeling strong enough to stand up for themselves. They've got no freedoms. They're scared to tell anybody because they don't know if they're going to be taken away from their parents. They don't know if it is dad that's the perpetrator. They don't know if dad's going to be taken away or put into prison. You know, so it can be really confusing for children who are experiencing domestic abuse. In 2017, 87,000 women were killed globally. 58% of those women, 50,000 of them, were killed by their intimate partners or other family members. So that equates to 137 women being killed on a daily basis across the world. In the last 2 years, coronavirus has killed nearly 4 million people worldwide. But we are hoping that when if the vaccine is rolled out worldwide, we're all really hoping for that there will be an end to that, or it will slow. Domestic abuse does not seem to be slowing. There's no vaccine for domestic abuse. The radiating impact of domestic abuse and the physical and mental health risks to women and children and some men are far-reaching. So it doesn't just impact the individual, it impacts the individual's family, it impacts the children, it impacts the health service, the police service. Nigel was talking about the police, and he, you know, and what he's doing with perpetrators. That work with perpetrators is incredibly important. But actually, quite often perpetrators have lived with domestic abuse, you know, and they go on to become perpetrators. Victims who have lived with domestic abuse as children are more likely to go on and become victims of domestic abuse. So we need to stop it. We need to be raising awareness around it. And when I talk about, Zoe knows that I have a real passion about this, but when I talk about raising awareness around domestic abuse. It is so important. We need to have more public health campaigns around it, and it needs to stop being so hidden. We need to be calling each other out on it if we see it. And when I parallel it to drink driving, I'm 53, and 40 years ago, it wasn't unknown for parents to get in a car, drive out to a pub, have a few drinks, come back with the children not strapped in the back, no seatbelts on, they're 3 sheets to the wind, driving home, few drinks. So dangerous, but it wasn't an unknown thing to happen. Now, because of the really successful public, or fairly successful public health campaign that's gone out around drink driving, as a society, we frown on it. If I saw somebody getting into a car and they'd had too much to drink, I would take their keys off them. I would really be saying, that's not safe, that's not okay, you could really kill someone, you could hurt someone. And at no point during that time have I heard any of those public health campaigns around drink driving say, it's Christmas time, the police are going to be out, they're going to be out in numbers, and they're going to be checking whether you're driving and you've had too much to drink. They're going to be doing that. At no time have I heard anybody saying in those campaigns, don't go out at Christmas because you might get hit by a drink driver. Don't go into a pub at Christmas time, because if you're in a pub at Christmas time and a drink driver offers you a lift, you might find it difficult to say no. Don't walk down the pavement at Christmas time, because there are more drink drivers about and they might hit you. Because what we clearly know is it's the perpetrator's fault. If a perpetrator gets into a car with a drink in them, we know it's their fault if they have an accident. But for some reason around domestic abuse, and sexual violence, we say to women and children, don't wear that short skirt, don't wear that low cut top, don't walk down that alley, don't if you meet somebody who's abusive, then make sure that you don't go on a second date with them. And we give all those messages to the victim. Now, I'm not saying we don't need some crisis management around domestic abuse, but we need more perpetrator management. And, I think unless we start doing that, unless we start looking at how perpetrators are behaving and we hold them accountable, and we start to do that underpinning work, that really important work that Nigel is doing, then actually we are not going to stop abuse. So we need to be kind of understanding the root causes of abuse. So prevalence here, I'm not going to go through all of this. You will get the PowerPoint afterwards, I think. Is that right, Zoe? Yeah, so in the UK, an estimated 1.3 million women, 695,000 men experience domestic abuse a year. The police receive a call in Plymouth, I know, on average about every 40 seconds, and every 6 seconds within the UK, a woman is being assaulted in her home. 1 in 7 children will have experienced living in a domestically abusive household. Those are the ones we know about. Those are the ones that disclose. There's a link between domestic abuse and other forms of abuse, including child abuse, sexual, physical, emotional, and neglect. Those are the 4 categories of abuse: animal abuse and child sexual exploitation. It is a misuse of power, and there are lots of theoretical reasons as to why it happens. But the point is, it's not okay. So we haven't got time to unpick all the causal reasons for it, but the point is, it's not okay. Domestic abuse is not about alcohol, it's not about mental health, and it's not about stress. However, those things have a correlation with increased risk for domestic abuse. So it makes the perpetrator more unpredictable, and it makes the victim more vulnerable. And actually, Nick Appleby asked me this morning about, was there a correlation, or is there a link between football results and an increase in domestic abuse? And I had to think about that, but actually it's not the result, it's the amount of alcohol that's consumed and the patriarchal culture of football. Now, that's not to say that everybody who watches a football match goes home and harms their partner or their children. but actually there is a correlation, and the police will agree with me there, between an increase in alcohol. So, and of course that culture around football is, there's alcohol, and it's a patriarchal culture. So so they're not causal, but there is a correlation, and it does increase the risk to women and children. So, and there is a spike, from what I understand, in calls around football tournaments in relation to domestic abuse. So there are several forms of abuse, and this list isn't exhaustive, of course. So there's psychological abuse, name calling, manipulation, threats, blaming, gaslighting, so where somebody is pretending that you're paranoid, and that can happen quite often when affairs are happening as well. Economic abuse, controlling access to money and resource, restriction of work, debt, sexual abuse, manipulation into sexual acts that feel uncomfortable, watching sexual material, physical assault, including rape. So when we think of sexual abuse, we immediately, I'm not saying you, but quite often we immediately think of those acts, those physical acts. But actually, sexual abuse is making somebody feel uncomfortable within that sphere, and that isn't okay. Coercive control, so a pattern of coercion in order to gain control. And again, when we're talking to children and young people about healthy relationships, I've done some of that work, and Wendy and I have done some work before in Wendy's previous life in a school that she worked in, and I worked with some of the year 9s around healthy relationships, and we gave them that language around what coercion is, and explained to them that coercion is present all the time. You are coerced to go to school, you are coerced to get out of bed in the morning, you're coerced to clean your bedroom, but actually, if you're being coerced into doing something that makes you feel uncomfortable, that is not okay, and you can tell somebody. And giving children and young people that language really does help them to disclose, because actually, if a child says something just doesn't feel quite right, that might not be heard. But if a child says, I'm being coerced into doing something I feel uncomfortable with or about, that's heard. We hear that language. So I think it's important to give children that language, and we can do that age appropriately as well. We can do that, and I think from year 5 and 6 upwards, we can be giving that language. COVID makes domestic abuse more invisible. Okay, so it's increased the risk to victims. There's some statistics here, and obviously you will get the slides. There is a big impact on children, of course, because because of lockdown, they've been unable to disclose. They've not been able to go into school. They're self-isolating. They haven't got access to those wider networks of grandparents, families, to disclose, and there are lots of references here. I would really recommend that you access the Women's Aid document, A Perfect Storm, because the pandemic's seen an increase of children contacting Childline of 40%. So I think, and peer attachments have only been able to be maintained online, and peer attachments for children who are living with domestic abuse are incredibly important in order to keep them safe. And also those peer attachments and their families are incredibly important to keep them safe. Refuge spaces have been reduced due to lack of staffing capacity, lack of PPA funding, but there are some innovative new ways of working with women, such as live chat lines, online secure support spaces. Ask Annie. Hopefully most of you will know about this, but this is a new initiative that's been rolled out with pharmacies. So if a woman or a child or anybody who's being abused goes into a pharmacy and asks for Annie, then there should be a trained member of staff there who will help them to access relevant support services. I'd really like you to think about how we work as professionals, because when we're thinking about women, particularly who are being abused, there is a big focus on women being the only solution to keeping the child safe. And they are signing working agreements, and actually if they break those working agreements, so for example, if if the perpetrator turns up at the house and they let them in because they've been threatening to kill the children and the victim, and they're let in, actually then that woman may lose her children. You know, they may be taken into care because she's broken that working agreement. So it needs to be, those working agreements can be useful, but actually they need to be done in conjunction and agreed with the person that's being abused, because they know how to keep their children safe best. So that's, you know, incredibly important. So and all of these documents, there are, you know, there's quite a lot of references and reading for you to look at. Also, this, I wasn't planning on showing you this film, but this very clearly demonstrates how some agencies can work in silos. So yeah, Marion Hester, the 3 planets model, that might be something that you want to look at. Sorry, I am rushing. Right. So going forward, domestic abuse is an incredibly complex crime. It's hidden, happens in families where people are supposed to feel safe. As professionals, we need to recognise that children are not innocent bystanders. The new Domestic Abuse Bill is going to recognise children, or Domestic Abuse Act is going to recognise children as victims of abuse. And there are going to be new special measures put into courts, family courts and the criminal justice system to support victims of domestic abuse and children. And the coercive controlling laws are going to be strengthened to include post-separation abuse, because the abuse doesn't finish when the victim and the perpetrator split. It continues quite often, particularly where children are involved. And economic abuse is also going to be addressed. So there will be, obviously there's more to the bill than that and more to the act than that, but those are some of the main points. And I've put some help here, some help lines here that you could contact if you needed to at the end of this session, but hopefully everybody is still feeling safe. So, and again, there are pages and pages of references and additional reading. So I'm sorry it was such a whistle-stop tour, and I'm sure a lot of you will know a lot of this stuff, but it's just really raising our awareness around the impact on children, because it can have a lifelong devastating impact for them. Okay.
Thank you so much, Anne. And I know, you know, 15 minutes, we it's nothing on this subject. Something that we'll talk about a bit later on in the day is the research and development groups within the Learning Institute. And Anne is chair of our one that focuses on domestic abuse. So hold that thought till later. The chat, Anne, has gone bonkers. There's lots of questions and comments there, which I'm sure Michelle will pick up with you in a minute. We did promise a Q&A. We might be able to pick out a few just before we send you off for lunch, but we'll be back at 1:30 for our workshops. So Michelle, I don't know if we can just pick out perhaps some themes and some comments in those from the chat and perhaps direct them to the speakers.
So many of the questions were answered by the individuals incredibly efficiently, but I don't know whether all participants have been able to follow the chat and those answers. So I'll just pick out the kind of key things. There were some general ones. Glenda wanted to know if this training will be extended to support staff in schools and other organisations. Now, I'm not sure whether that question came during the first session, but I don't know whether it was about this conference or whether it was about the Quaker Peace Education Restore framework. So Nick answered that one. I don't know if you want to comment, Nick, but the answer was yes, very much so. Lots of work with other organisations. Pamela Phillips wanted to know if the conference is available afterwards. Yes, indeed it is. Now this one, again, not sure if this was directly about peace education or about this conference. Melanie asked, has this project included early years education? That one hasn't been answered. So Melanie, I don't know if you want to clarify whether you're talking about Restore or whether you're talking about this conference. The question was about early years education.
Peace education has just popped up there, so
I can respond briefly to that if that's helpful, Michelle. the short answer is yes. Peace education is very active in early years and is very important there because it's because of the developmental things that are happening at that age. Restore, I think, has been more developed in the secondary context, but I think the kind of idea of a restorative culture is very embedded in lots of early year settings and in SEN settings as well, where it's actually, I think, crucial to that, to kind of giving young people agency.
Thank you, Ellis. So moving on now to the Wave Trust talk with Aidan. There was a question from Alison: how long did the housing project, I think it was to do with the housing project, particularly take? And Aidan answered that with around a year. I think that's right, Aidan. But there's a fulsome answer in the chat, which I think people can access now.
I think I would just jump in then to Michelle to say,
absolutely,
within a year, they were seeing the results. So in this case, they only trained a couple of people to do the intensive approach. And so they started early. And with this approach, really a lot of it early on is trial and error to work out how it works for you. But within a few months, they were starting to see improvements in the responses they were getting. And over time, they were both getting better results for the tenants and also saving money. So yeah, within quite a short space of time.
Fantastic. Our third speaker, Nigel, there are some questions that you answered, Nigel, very fulsomely, but again, I don't know if participants have been able to follow the chat, so I'll just summarise those. Ruth asked, do police forces across the country share what they do? And Nigel was answering yes, very much so. There's a national criteria set by the Ministry of Justice for IOM units in all counties. Nigel, do you want to add anything there? Shall I list the questions and then you can comment generally, or?
No, that was it. It was actually correct. It's done by MJ. There's been a reform for IOM, and it falls in line with what probation are doing throughout the country. So that goes with that. Shane asked about some youth work and things like that with CAMS in Devon.
Yes,
we do work with young people. We do link into youth offending teams, but we generally take from about 17 and a half upwards. But we do have those links where we know the people that are going to jump from the youth offending services into our service. So we do work closely with them. And then there was a question from Amy about housing and that it's few and far between. It was a question, it's more of a statement really, but she's quite right. There is more housing needed, and it's one of those things that we're working on. It's better now that things are commissioned with regards to housing, and there are more properties popping up that we can use, and they're very good.
We've got a question just come up, Nigel, from Emily Spragg. Where does the IOM sit in terms of working with those who repeatedly offend, who are currently in prison, before and in preparation for release, other than the housing you already mentioned? Quite a lengthy question there, but it's in the chat.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, it's a difficult one. This is why the policing side of things is different for us, is because most people will catch, convict, so they get the files done, they send them off to court, and that's the last they hear of them until they come out again and commit a further crime. We pick things up with probation from court or sometimes from custody onwards. So we'll work with the offenders that are going into prison. We'll work with them while they're at prison to see what their inspirations are and everything else that they want to do when they come out. Some give us a long list, some give us a very wishful list, and some can't be bothered. So we try and coerce those to work with us and work and get the help. So, and then when they come out, we continue work with them. So that's when they're on our cohort. They're on probation as a license. We continue with them so they become what they call a non-statutory case. And we'll continue with them, so we just don't drop them off until they've got some sort of stability and things like that. So it's very much an all-encompassing working with them from being charged right through to getting them help and try to stop that offending. So yeah. So that.
Thank you, Nigel. For Wendy, there were no questions, but lots of positive comments about teachers, which is really encouraging. A couple of negative ones, which were a bit horrifying. And for Anne, again, lots of positive comments and thanks for taking the time to outline the inclusive nature of domestic abuse. a couple of points that I don't know if people have been able to follow, might be worth pointing out from the chat. Pamela added to Anne's suggestion that Home Truths was extremely interesting programme, and Lisa Money wrote about some brilliant training on domestic violence that highlighted the perpetrator's sense of entitlement. So I don't know if Lisa wants to share where or who gave that training, or what the title is, and whether people can then access that. I don't know.
Perhaps Lisa can comment in
the chat. Yeah,
all of this will be.
okay.
So
that's it from me. I think that those are all the comments and questions that were really significant and not answered or commented on by others.
Absolutely brilliant. And I suppose one final comment from me, and this comes back to the very heart of the project. I think a lot of us here are local to Devon and Cornwall. We've had some amazing speakers this morning. Please keep in touch with them. You know, make this the start of, you know, talking to agencies or to individuals that you haven't done so before. You know, that would make my day, is that if we can get some of these relationships and conversations going, you know, we've achieved what we've set out to do.